Unaware his wife and triplet daughters would one day build a 20 billion Nigerian naira's empire from a single room in Ajegunle, Chukwudi signed the divorce papers with a sneer, believing he was finally free from the struggling woman who could never give him the status he craved. To him, Adanna was a closed chapter, a worn-out wife in faded wrappers who spent years hawking chin-chin in dusty markets while he climbed the corporate ladder. But as he slipped a wedding ring onto the finger of Mrs. Ajegunle, his elegant, powerful boss who promised him penthouse living and executive privilege, he had no idea that Adanna, the woman he discarded like yesterday's newspaper, was about to transform her daughters into business moguls whose success would dwarf everything he'd ever touched. Nor did he know that the same three girls he called anchors dragging him down would one day grace magazine covers as the Triplet Queens, building a food empire that would make his boss's hotel chain look modest. But what happens when the man who abandoned his family for luxury discovers they became wealthier than the woman he married for money? When the wife he publicly humiliated in court rises with nothing but a grinding machine, a hand-drawn logo, and an unbreakable bond with her daughters. And what will Chukwudi do when he realizes Adanna's next move isn't forgiveness or reconciliation, but something far more devastating? Adanna Okafor once believed in forever. Her marriage to Chukwudi was supposed to be the dream, the fairy tale built on love, Sunday church services, and late-night promises whispered over shared plates of jollof rice and dreams of growing old together. But marriage had turned her into a ghost, one who cooked his meals, smiled through his coldness, and blamed herself each time he came home late smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. Chukwudi, a mid-level bank manager at First Gateway Bank in Lagos, had grown distant over the years. His eyes would glaze over during family dinners. His phone buzzed constantly with messages he'd hide with guilty smirks. The word ambitious had become his excuse for everything, missing birthdays, forgetting anniversaries, ignoring his own daughters. The night he left, she didn't scream. She just stood by the dining table in their modest Surulere flat, her hands trembling as she watched him place the divorce papers down with the casual indifference of someone discarding junk mail. The rain hammered against the windows like fists demanding entry. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face, handsome still, but cold, so terribly cold. Behind him, barely visible in the doorway, stood their triplet daughters, Zara, Amara, and Chisholm, aged 9, clutching each other in matching faded dresses Adanna had sewn by hand. Their wide eyes reflected confusion, fear, and something that would haunt Adanna for months. The look of children learning that fathers could abandon them without looking back. "You're beneath me now," Chukwudi said, his voice dripping with contempt as he adjusted his Rolex, a gift, she later learned, from Mrs. Ajegunle. "You and these girls are anchors. Dead weight. Mrs. Ajegunle can give me the life I deserve. A penthouse in Lekki. VP position. Respect. What have you given me? Pepper soup and poverty." Adanna's throat tightened, but she refused to cry. Not in front of her daughters. Not in front of this man who'd become a stranger. Weeks later, when the court hearing arrived, humiliation came dressed in expensive legal fees Chukwudi's new benefactor had paid for. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman in designer heels, mocked Adanna publicly, calling her uneducated, a financial burden, someone who contributed nothing but mediocrity to the marriage. Mrs. Ajegunle sat in the gallery like royalty, draped in gold jewelry that caught the fluorescent lights, her smile cold and victorious. She didn't even try to hide her presence. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, watched Adanna's silent tears as the triplets clutched their mother's worn wrapper. But the law was the law. Chukwudi walked free. Adanna walked out with nothing but her daughters, a court-mandated child support payment so small it was almost insulting, and her dignity hanging by a thread. The eviction notice came 3 weeks later. Chukwudi had stopped paying rent on their Surulere flat, claiming his new life had expenses. Adanna and the girls were forced into a single room in Ajegunle, a neighborhood where the roof leaked during rainstorms, the streets smelled of open gutters, and hope seemed like a luxury only the foolish could afford. At night, lying on a thin mattress with her 3 daughters pressed against her for warmth, Adanna would stare at the water-stained ceiling and feel something inside her crack a little more each day. But then, one morning at 4 a.m., as she lay awake listening to the sounds of the waking slum, hawkers preparing their wares, generators coughing to life, children crying in neighboring rooms, Adanna made a decision. She wouldn't let despair win. She sold her wedding gold, the only thing of value she had left, and bought a small grinding machine from Balogun Market. She would make pepper paste. She would wake before dawn. She would fight. The triplets became her soldiers. Zara, the eldest by 3 minutes, learned to package the paste in small plastic bags with the precision of a factory worker. Amara, quiet and brilliant with numbers, kept their accounts in a tattered notebook she'd salvaged from school, tracking every naira earned and spent. And Chisholm, the dreamer who still believed in magic despite everything, designed their first logo by hand with crayons, 3 intertwined stars she called Triplet Fire, because, she said, "We burn brighter together, Mama." Every morning, they would wake at 4 a.m. in their single room. Adanna would grind peppers until her hands ached and her eyes burned from the fumes. The girls would package, label, and prepare for the day ahead. By 6 a.m., they'd be at Balogun Market, hawking their products among thousands of other desperate vendors. It was backbreaking, humiliating, exhausting. But they were together. And slowly, painfully, coin by coin, they were surviving. One scorching afternoon, 6 months into their new life, disaster struck. Adanna's grinding machine, her lifeline, her only means of production, broke down. She sat in a market surrounded by unsold inventory, watching her daughters' frightened faces, and for the first time since the divorce, she wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. She wept like a woman who'd reached the absolute end of her strength, certain they would starve, certain this was the final blow. But then, through her tears, she heard a voice. "NWAM, dry your eyes." Maman Karuka, an elderly Igbo trader who'd watched Adanna's quiet resilience for months from her neighboring stall, approached with steady steps and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone else's. She was small, weathered, her wrapper faded from years of washing, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd survived worse and emerged stronger. "I will lend you capital," Maman Karuka said simply. "Enough to buy a better machine. Enough to rent a proper stall. But you must promise me one thing, NWAM." Adanna looked up, tears still streaming down her face. "Anything, Ma." The old woman's gaze was steel-wrapped in compassion. "Never let shame steal your fire. You hear me? The world will try. Men will try. Poverty will try. But you have something they don't. You have purpose. You have these 3 lights beside you, and you have the kind of strength that only comes from being broken and choosing to rebuild. Promise me you will never forget that." Adanna's voice came out as a whisper, but it was a vow. "I promise, Ma." That promise became her prayer, her battle cry, her salvation. Within 1 year, Adanna's pepper paste, now rebranded as Triplet Fire Spice, with Chisholm's hand-drawn logo professionally printed on every package, became a sensation in Lagos markets. Customers praised its authenticity, its fire, its flavor that reminded them of home-cooked meals their grandmothers used to make. Word spread from Balogun to Yaba to Ikeja. Market women began requesting it by name. Restaurant owners started buying in bulk. The girls, now teenagers, juggled school and business with the discipline of soldiers. Zara, brilliant and driven, earned a scholarship to University of Lagos, where she studied business management, returning home each evening to run operations with the precision of a CEO. Amara, who'd always loved science, became a food technologist, experimenting with organic blends and preservation techniques that extended their product's shelf life and opened doors to larger distributors. And Chisholm, the artist whose crayon logo had started it all, refined her vision into award-winning packaging designs that made Triplet Fire stand out on crowded shelves. They made a vow, the four of them, sitting in their small stall one Sunday after church. One day, we will build an empire. One day, Mama will never cry again. One day, the world will know our names not because of what was done to us, but because of what we built from ashes. Meanwhile, across Lagos in a gleaming Lekki penthouse, Chukwudi's fairy tale was curdling into a nightmare. Mrs. Okonkwo, it turned out, had not married him for love or companionship. She'd married him to parade a younger, handsome husband at society events, a trophy to display before her wealthy friends and business rivals. Behind closed doors, she was a tyrant. She'd made him sign a prenup that left him with nothing if they divorced. She micromanaged his work until he was little more than a glorified assistant, stripped of the VP title she'd promised. She belittled him constantly, calling him bush boy and gold digger in private, while publicly she flaunted affairs with younger men, humiliating him at every turn. Chukwudi, drowning in regret and wounded pride, tried to reconnect with his daughters. He called Adanna's old number. Disconnected. He asked around Surulere. They'd moved, no one knew where. His pride, the same pride that had driven him to abandon them, now stopped him from searching harder. Besides, what would he say? How could he face them? 5 years passed like chapters in a book he was no longer part of. Then, one Monday morning, as Chukwudi sat in Mrs. Okonkwo's guest bedroom, she'd long since moved him out of the master suite, a business magazine was delivered to the house. The cover made his hands tremble. The Triplet Queens. How 3 sisters built a 20 billion Nigerian naira's food empire from Ajegunle. The article was detailed, devastating, and viral within hours. It told Adanna's story, her resilience as a single mother, her early morning grind at Balogun Market, the elderly trader who'd believed in her when no one else did, and the 3 daughters who'd become her partners in building something extraordinary. Triplet Fire Spice had gone national, then international. Their products were now sold in ShopRite, on Amazon, in European specialty stores. Zara ran operations with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO. Amara's food science innovations had earned industry awards. Chisholm's artistic vision had turned their packaging into museum-worthy design. And buried in paragraph 7, like a knife twisted slowly, Ms. Okafor credits her success to her daughter's unwavering support during the darkest period of her life. After her ex-husband abandoned the family to marry his wealthy boss, leaving them destitute and homeless, the internet exploded. Social media turned Chukwudi into a pariah overnight. His colleagues whispered in elevators. Strangers recognized him on the street and called him the man who threw away billions. Mrs. Okonkwo, terrified the scandal would taint her brand, filed for divorce that same week, citing irreconcilable differences and reputational damage. She left him jobless, penniless, and utterly destroyed. Desperate, humiliated, and with nowhere else to turn, Chukwudi did the unthinkable. He tracked down the address for Triplet Fire Global Headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in Victoria Island, a building that rivaled Mrs. Okonkwo's hotels in grandeur, and arrived on the day of its grand opening. Media crews swarmed the entrance. Security guards in crisp uniforms lined the red carpet. Investors in designer suits sipped champagne and networked beneath massive banners displaying the Triplet Fire logo, 3 intertwined stars burning bright. And there, at the center of it all, stood Adanna. She was unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in presence. Gone was the woman in faded wrappers and worn slippers. She wore a tailored iro and buba in deep emerald green, her head wrap wrapped with regal precision, her skin glowing with health and confidence. Beside her stood Zara, Amara, and Chisholm, beautiful, poised, powerful, holding scissors as they prepared to cut the ceremonial ribbon before a crowd of journalists, investors, and dignitaries. Chukwudi pushed through the crowd, his voice cracking with desperation. Adanna, please. I need to talk to you. The crowd parted, cameras swiveling toward the commotion. Security moved forward, but Adanna raised one hand, stopping them. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time in 5 years. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred, just a quiet, unshakable strength that made him feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. "Chikwudi," she said softly, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "You taught my daughters the most valuable lesson a father could teach, though I doubt it was intentional." He stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Please let me be part of this. Let me be part of their lives again. Our success. Our success." Adanna's voice remained calm, but it cut like steel. "There is no R, Chikwudi. This empire was built at 4 a.m. in a single room in Ajegunle while you slept in a penthouse. It was built with grinding machines and tattered notebooks and a hand-drawn logo made with crayons. It was built by 3 girls you called anchors and a woman you called beneath you." She stepped closer, her daughters moving with her, a united front. "You taught them that a woman's worth is not defined by the man who underestimates her. That resilience matters more than privilege. That love and hard work will always outlast arrogance and greed. For that lesson, I thank you. But you're not part of the story anymore. You gave up that right the night you walked away." Security moved forward again. This time, she didn't stop them. As they escorted Chikwudi out, cameras flashing, the crowd murmuring, the triplets stood beside their mother, arms linked, 3 stars burning bright, just as Chisholm had once drawn. Months later, at Triplet Fire's anniversary gala, a viral video surfaced that brought the entire crowd to tears. Mama Nkaruka, the elderly trader who'd lent Adanna capital when no one else believed, was revealed as a silent investor in the company. She'd never asked for recognition or profit beyond her initial return. She'd simply bet on love over greed, on potential over appearances, on a mother's fire that refused to be extinguished. When Adanna honored her on stage as the grandmother who believed when the world turned away, Mama Nkaruka wept. The crowd wept. And across Nigeria, millions watching online wept too. The moral blazed clear as the Lagos sun. Humility, resilience, and love will always outlast arrogance, greed, and betrayal. Those who discard the powerless today may one day kneel before the empire they built from ashes. And a woman who refuses to let shame steal her fire will always burn brighter than those who tried to extinguish her. The courtroom smelled of old wood and broken promises. Adanna sat on a hard bench in the back row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her worn wrapper smoothed over her knees with the kind of care that came from having nothing else to control. Beside her, the triplets sat rigid and silent, Zara gripping her mother's arm, Amara staring at the floor, Chisholm's eyes wide and glassy with tears she was too young to understand but old enough to feel. At the front of the room, Chikwudi stood tall in a charcoal suit Adanna had never seen before, crisp and expensive, the kind of outfit that announced he'd already moved into a different world. His lawyer, a woman with razor-sharp cheekbones and heels that clicked like accusations against the tile floor, shuffled papers with the bored efficiency of someone who destroyed families before breakfast and would do it again before lunch. Mrs. Ajegunle sat in the gallery, draped in gold jewelry that caught the fluorescent lights and threw tiny reflections across the walls like scattered coins. She didn't even try to hide her presence. Her smile was cold, victorious, the smile of a woman who'd won a prize she hadn't even wanted, just enjoyed taking from someone else. When the proceedings began, Chikwidi's lawyer wasted no time. Her voice cut through the stuffy air with practiced cruelty. "Your Honor, my client has been financially supporting a woman who contributed nothing to the marriage. No formal education, no career, no ambition beyond hawking snacks in markets like a common roadside vendor. She has been, quite frankly, a financial burden for 17 years. Adanna's breath caught. The words hit like stones, each one carefully aimed. Around the courtroom, people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too many women in Adanna's position, glanced up from her notes but said nothing. My client deserves the opportunity to build a life with someone who matches his aspirations, the lawyer continued, her tone suggesting Adanna was livestock being appraised and found lacking. Someone who can support his career, not drag it down with her mediocrity. Zara's grip on Adanna's arm tightened until it hurt. Amara's breathing had gone shallow. Chisholm whispered, "Mama," but Adanna couldn't respond. Her throat had closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't defend herself. The courtroom felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in, the air too thick to breathe. Chikwudi never looked at her. Not once. When the judge asked if he had anything to add, he simply said, "I'll pay the minimum child support required by law. Nothing more. They're not my responsibility anymore." The judge's pen scratched across the paper. The sound felt final, like a door slamming shut on 17 years of marriage, 3 children, countless sacrifices, and every whispered promise ever made. Divorce granted. Adanna stood on trembling legs, her daughters clutching her wrapper like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just proven fathers could sign away love with a pen stroke and lawyers could reduce mothers to nothing with carefully chosen words. As they walked out into the blinding Lego sunlight, Mrs. Okonkwo's laughter echoed behind them, bright and sharp as breaking glass. Adanna didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside her had cracked, and she wasn't sure how to put it back together. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door like a death sentence written in bureaucratic language. Adanna found it when she returned from dropping the girls at school, the paper crisp and official against the worn tile of their Surulere flat. Her hands shook as she read the words. Failure to pay rent for 3 consecutive months. Vacate premises within 7 days. Legal action will be pursued. She called Chikwudi 17 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. On the 18th attempt, a woman answered. Not Mrs. Okonkwo, but someone younger, probably a secretary or assistant. Mr. Okafor is no longer taking calls from this number. Please direct all communication through his lawyer. Adanna's voice cracked. I need to speak to him about our rent. Our daughters. Through his lawyer. Goodbye. The line went dead. For 3 days, Adanna tried everything. She begged the landlord for more time. She approached relatives who suddenly remembered urgent commitments and closed doors in her face. She pawned her mother's old sewing machine for a fraction of what it was worth, but it wasn't enough. The math was cruel and simple. She had nowhere near what she needed, and the world had run out of mercy. On the 7th day, 2 men arrived with a pickup truck and dead eyes that had seen this scene play out 1,000 times before. They didn't speak much, just started carrying furniture out while Adanna frantically stuffed clothes into plastic bags, her movements jerky with panic. The triplets came home from school to find their mattresses on the street, their few toys scattered across the pavement like debris from a shipwreck. Chisholm started crying first, silent tears streaming down her round cheeks. Then Amara. Then Zara, who'd been trying so hard to be strong, finally broke, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Neighbors watched from windows and doorways, some with pity, others with the carefully blank expressions of people who knew they might be next and couldn't afford the luxury of sympathy. Where are we going, Mama? Zara whispered. Adanna didn't have an answer, not one that wouldn't terrify them more. They ended up in Ajegunle because it was the only place Adanna could afford with what little remained after selling her wedding gold, the last piece of her marriage that held any value. The room was smaller than their old living room, with walls stained brown from years of leaked water and mold. The ceiling had a crack that let in rain. The single window overlooked an open gutter where garbage floated like offerings to forgotten gods. At night, mosquitoes swarmed, and the sounds of the slum never stopped. Generators coughing, children crying, couples fighting, music blaring from competing speakers. The first night, they lay together on a thin mattress that smelled of mothballs and previous tragedies, for bodies pressed close because there was no other furniture, no other choice. The girls pretended to sleep, but Adanna felt their shallow breathing, heard the small sounds they made trying not to cry. She stared at the water-stained ceiling and thought about Chikwudi in his lecky penthouse, probably sleeping in thousand-thread count sheets, probably not thinking about them at all. The rage came then, hot and pure, burning through the numbness that had protected her since the divorce. Not rage at him. She'd wasted enough tears on him already, but rage at her own powerlessness, at a world that let men discard families like yesterday's trash, at 17 years of making herself small in hopes that humility would be rewarded. "Mama?" Chisholm's whisper cut through the darkness. "Are we going to be okay?" Adanna's throat tightened, but she forced strength into her voice. "Yes, my love. We're going to be more than okay." She didn't know yet how she'd make that true. But lying there in that single room in Ajegunle, listening to her daughters breathe and watching rain drip through the ceiling crack, Adanna made a silent vow. She would find a way. She had to. Because the alternative, giving up, breaking, letting this defeat define them, was simply not an option. The alarm went off at 3:45 a.m., a shrill sound that shattered the fragile quiet of their single room. Adanna silenced it quickly, her movements practiced now after 2 weeks of this brutal routine. In the darkness, she could hear the girls stirring, small bodies shifting on the thin mattress they all shared. "Mama, I'm awake," Zara whispered, already sitting up, her silhouette barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. "Me too," Amara added, her voice thick with sleep, but determined. Chisholm said nothing, just reached for her mother's hand in the dark. They moved like shadows, dressing quietly so as not to wake the neighbors whose anger at early morning noise had made their first week here even more miserable. Adanna lit the small kerosene stove she'd bought from a scrap dealer, its flame casting dancing shadows across walls that seemed to close in tighter each day. The grinding machine, purchased with the money from her melted wedding gold, sat in the corner like a small altar to survival. By 4:15 a.m., Adanna was grinding peppers, onions, and tomatoes, the acrid smell filling their tiny room and burning their eyes until tears streamed down their faces. But they'd learned not to complain. Tears from pepper grinding were honest tears, tears with purpose, unlike the useless ones shed over abandonment and broken promises. Zara worked beside her mother with the efficiency of a factory worker, scooping the ground paste into small plastic bags they'd bought in bulk from Ballaghan Market. Her movements were precise, measured, each bag containing exactly the same amount because Amara had calculated that consistency would build customer trust. At 10 years old, Zara's hands moved with the muscle memory of someone 3 times her age. Amara sat cross-legged on the mattress, her tattered notebook open across her lap, writing by the light of a small torch they'd wrapped in cloth to soften the glare. She tracked everything. How many bags they'd produced, how much each ingredient cost, what their profit margin needed to be, where they'd sold the most yesterday. Numbers made sense to her in a way the chaos of their new life didn't. In the neat columns of her accounting, there was order, control, hope measured in naira and kobo. Chisholm, the youngest by 7 minutes, and the one who still sometimes woke crying for the home they'd lost, had found her own role. She sat at their makeshift table. A wooden crate turned on its side, with the crayons a teacher had given her out of pity, designing labels on scraps of paper salvaged from the market. Her latest drawing showed 3 stars intertwined, their points touching, creating a shape that looked almost like a flame. "What do you call it?" Adanna had asked the first time Chisholm showed her. "Triplet Fire," Chisholm said simply. "Because we're 3, and we burn bright together. Nobody can blow us out, Mama. Not even Papa." Adanna had held her daughter then, this child who still believed in magic despite everything, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile, too naive. But something harder. Something that might sustain them when hope ran dry. By 5:30 a.m., they had 40 bags ready. By 6 a.m., they were walking through Ajegunle's waking streets. Adanna carrying the basin of packaged pepper paste on her head, the girls walking beside her like small soldiers marching toward a battle they were too young to fight but too proud to avoid. Market women were already setting up stalls, generators sputtering to life, the smell of akara frying mixing with exhaust fumes and open sewage. At Ballaghan Market, They claimed their small space between a woman selling dried fish and a man hawking phone accessories. The competition was brutal. Thousands of vendors shouting, pushing, fighting for customers' attention and naira. But they had something others didn't. They had each other, and they had a story written in every carefully packaged bag. Fresh pepper paste. Ground this morning. Adanna's voice, once so soft and apologetic, had learned to carry. Triplet Fire Spice. Authentic taste, no preservatives. The girls echoed her, their young voices cutting through the market chaos. Zara handled money with the seriousness of a bank teller. Amara kept mental tallies of inventory, alerting her mother when they were running low on stock. Chisholm showed customers her hand-drawn labels, her smile still innocent enough to melt even the hardest haggler's heart. By noon, when the sun turned the market into an oven and exhaustion made their legs shake, they'd sold 23 bags. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to buy rice and tomatoes for dinner. Enough to prove they could survive another day. Walking home that evening, Zara suddenly stopped and turned to her sisters. "We're going to make it," she said, her voice fierce with a conviction that seemed too old for her young face. "One day, Mama won't have to carry anything on her head. One day, we'll have a real shop. Maybe even more." Amara nodded, clutching her precious notebook. "I'll make sure we never waste money. Every kobo counts." Chisholm held up her latest drawing, the 3 intertwined stars catching the fading sunlight. "And everyone will know our fire. The whole world, maybe." Adanna looked at her daughters, these 3 lights who should have been playing with dolls and worrying about homework, but instead were learning business and survival, and felt something fierce in her chest. They'd been abandoned, humiliated, cast aside like trash. But they were still here, still fighting, still burning. "Together," she whispered, pulling them close. "We burn together." And in that moment, walking through Ajegunle's dusty streets with empty basins and tired feet, the Triplet Fire wasn't just a logo. It was a promise. The grinding machine died on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the dry season, when the Lagos heat turned the air thick enough to chew and desperation tasted like dust. Adanna was mid-grind, peppers and tomatoes half-processed, when the motor made a sound like metal tearing and simply stopped. She pressed the button again. Nothing. Again. Silence. Her hands started shaking before her mind caught up to what this meant. No machine meant no pepper paste. No pepper paste meant nothing to sell tomorrow. Nothing to sell meant no money for rice, for the girls' school fees already 2 weeks overdue, for the rent due in 5 days. The math spiraled in her head, each calculation more devastating than the last, until the numbers blurred into a single word pounding behind her eyes. Over. "Mama?" Zara's voice came from the doorway, cautious, already reading the disaster in her mother's posture. Adanna tried to speak, but nothing came out. She looked at the broken machine, at the half-finished product going to waste, at her daughters' faces beginning to mirror her panic, and something inside her finally shattered. The tears came without warning, violent and unstoppable, ripping through the careful composure she'd maintained for months. She sank to the floor beside the useless machine and wept, not the quiet, dignified crying she'd allowed herself in the darkest hours of night, but the raw, animal sounds of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of what a human being could endure. I can't. The words broke apart in her throat. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to do." The girls crowded around her, their small hands patting her shoulders, her back, their own tears starting because children always know when their mother has run out of strength. Chisholm buried her face in Adanna's wrapper. Amara clutched her accounting notebook like a talisman that had lost its power. Zara, trying so hard to be strong, finally gave up and just held her mother while they all cried together in their single room that smelled of failed pepper grinding and broken dreams. They didn't go to the market that day. They had nothing to sell, and Adanna couldn't find the will to pretend otherwise. The next morning, she forced herself to return to Balogun Market anyway, carrying yesterday's unsold bags and a weight in her chest that made breathing difficult. Maybe she could sell the old stock. Maybe she could borrow money from another vendor. Maybe, each maybe more desperate than the last. She set up in their usual spot, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she arranged the bags. Her voice, when she tried to call out to customers, came out thin and unconvincing. By noon, she'd sold only 3 bags, and the afternoon sun felt less like warmth and more like judgment. That's when she felt a presence beside her, a hand, weathered and steady, gently touching her shoulder. "NWAM," a voice said softly. "Dry your eyes." Adanna looked up into the face of Mama Nkaruka, the elderly Igbo trader who sold dried crayfish 3 stalls down. They'd exchanged greetings over the past months, the kind of polite acknowledgments that existed between market neighbors, but never more than that. Mama Nkaruka was small, her wrapper faded from countless washings, her head tie wrapped with the precision of someone who'd tied it the same way for 50 years. Her face was mapped with wrinkles, each line a story of survival, and her eyes held the particular wisdom that came from having been broken and choosing to rebuild. "My machine is broken," Adanna whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can't afford to fix it. I can't feed my children. I don't know what to do." Mama Nkaruka was quiet for a long moment, studying Adanna with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in months. Then she lowered herself onto the bench beside her, moving with the careful deliberation of old bones that had earned their aches. "How long have I been watching you?" Mama Nkaruka asked, though it didn't sound like a question that needed answering. "Every morning, you arrive with your daughters. 3 small girls who should be playing, but instead they work like they understand what survival costs. I watch how carefully you package your products, how you never cheat your customers even when you're desperate, how you speak to your daughters with love even when exhaustion makes your voice shake." Adanna's throat tightened. She hadn't realized anyone was watching, hadn't realized anyone cared. "I lost a daughter once," Mama Nkaruka continued, her voice steady despite the grief that flickered across her face. "Childbirth took her, left me with questions I'll never answer, and a hole nothing can fill. But watching you these months, NWAM, I see her spirit. That same fire. That same refusal to let the world grind you into dust." She reached into her wrapper and pulled out a small cloth bundle, worn soft from handling. Inside was money, more money than Adanna had seen in months. Her breath caught. "This is capital," Mama Nkaruka said. "Enough to buy a better machine. A stronger one. Enough to rent a small stall so you're not hawking in the sun anymore. Enough to expand. I don't know when I could pay you back. There is only one payment I require." Mama Nkaruka's hand closed over Adanna's, pressing the money into her palm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Promise me you will never let shame steal your fire. The world will try, NWAM, men will try, poverty will try, your own fear will try, but you have something rare. You have purpose, you have those 3 lights beside you, and you have the kind of strength that only comes from being broken and choosing to mend yourself with gold instead of hiding the cracks." Tears were streaming down Adanna's face again, but these felt different. Not the tears of despair, but something else. Something that might have been gratitude or hope or the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, she could actually survive this. "Promise me," Mama Nkaruka repeated, her eyes fierce. Adanna's voice came out as a whisper, but it was a vow. "I promise, Ma. I swear." The old woman smiled then, a smile that held both sorrow and triumph, the smile of someone who'd learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a cruel world is choose to believe in someone when no one else will. "Good," Mama Nkaruka said. "Now go buy your machine. Your fire is just beginning to burn." The new grinding machine was bigger, louder, and infinitely more beautiful than anything Adanna had ever owned. She'd bought it with Mama Nkaruka's capital, along with a proper stall in the covered section of Balogun Market, no longer hawking in the blazing sun, but operating from a real space with a corrugated iron roof and wooden shelves. The day they moved in, Chisholm had insisted on hanging her hand-drawn Triplet Fire logo above the entrance, the 3 intertwined stars visible from 20 stalls away. Within 3 months, word began to spread. Customers who'd bought once returned with friends. Restaurant owners started placing bulk orders. The pepper paste that Adanna ground at 4 a.m. was different from the mass-produced alternatives flooding the market. It tasted like home, like food cooked with care, like the meals grandmothers made before convenience replaced authenticity. It's the freshness, one customer explained to another while Adanna packaged their order. You can taste that it was made this morning. No preservatives. No chemicals. Just real food. But freshness alone didn't build empires. What set Triplet Fire apart was the family behind it, and they were growing in ways that had nothing to do with height or age. Zara, now 13, had transformed from a frightened child clutching her mother's wrapper into something fierce and focused. She'd earned a scholarship to a better secondary school in Java, and she attacked her business studies with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only inheritance worth pursuing. Every evening after school, she'd arrive at the stall and immediately begin reorganizing inventory, negotiating with suppliers who tried to cheat them because they were women, and keeping meticulous records that even Amara's accounting couldn't fault. "Mama, we need to think bigger," Zara said one evening as they counted the day's earnings. "We're selling 300 bags a week now. We could sell 3,000 if we had proper distribution. If we could get into grocery stores instead of just market stalls." Adanna looked at her daughter, this child woman with ambition blazing in her eyes, and felt both pride and fear. "That kind of expansion requires capital we don't have, Zara. We're doing well, but we can't." "Not yet," Zara interrupted, her voice respectful but firm. "But one day, we need to keep thinking about one day." Amara, meanwhile, had developed an obsession with food science that bordered on the spiritual. At 12, she discovered the public library in Java and began devouring every book she could find on preservation techniques, organic farming, and quality control. She started experimenting in their single room, testing different pepper varieties, adjusting spice ratios, documenting everything in notebooks that now numbered 7 and growing. "If we can extend the shelf life by even 3 days without adding chemicals," she explained to her mother with the seriousness of a university researcher, "we can distribute to areas outside Lagos. We can reach customers who can't come to the market every week." She succeeded on her 43rd attempt. The new formulation, using a specific ratio of natural ingredients Amara refused to share with anyone but family, extended freshness from 5 days to 8 without compromising flavor. When they tested it, even Mama Nkaruka, who'd been making pepper paste for 40 years, admitted she couldn't tell the difference. "This child has a gift from God," the old woman declared, shaking her head in wonder. "She sees things others don't." And Chisholm, the dreamer who'd started with crayons and scraps of paper, had caught the attention of a retired graphic designer who ran a printing shop near the market. Mr. Adeyemi had seen her drawings and offered to teach her properly, refusing payment because, as he said, "Talent like this doesn't come often, and I'm too old to let it go to waste." Under his guidance, Chisholm's hand-drawn logo evolved. The 3 intertwined stars became more sophisticated, more professional, but retained the heart that had made the original special. She designed proper labels, recipe cards to include with each package, eventually even banner advertisements for the stall. At 11 years old, she was already thinking in terms of brand identity, visual storytelling, and customer psychology. "People eat with their eyes first, Mama," she explained while sketching ideas for new packaging. "Our paste tastes better than everyone else's, but if it doesn't look beautiful, some people won't even try it." By the time Zara turned 15 and earned admission to University of Lagos on a full scholarship to study business administration, Triplet Fire Spice had expanded to 3 stalls across different markets in Lagos. They'd hired 2 women from Ajegunle to help with grinding and packaging. Women who reminded Adanna of herself 3 years ago, desperate and invisible. Paying them fair wages felt like repaying a debt to her former self. The evening Zara received her admission letter, the 4 of them sat together in their room, still the same single room in Ajegunle, because Adanna insisted on reinvesting every naira into the business rather than moving somewhere more comfortable. "We're really doing it," Amara whispered, looking at the letter like it was a prophecy coming true. We're actually building something. Zara held the letter carefully, her eyes bright with tears she was too proud to let fall. This is just the beginning. When I finish university, I'll know how to scale properly. I'll know how to negotiate with distributors, how to handle contracts, how to take us national. Chisholm was sketching again, always sketching. I'm designing our first billboard. For when we go international. The 3 stars will be huge, and underneath it'll say, from Ajegunle to the world. Adanna looked at her daughters. These 3 miracles who should have been crushed by poverty and abandonment, but had instead turned suffering into purpose, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 years. Not hope, which was still too fragile, but certainty. Cold, hard, unshakable certainty that they were going to make it, that they were going to be extraordinary. Make me a promise, she said quietly, and all 3 girls turned to her. Promise me that when we succeed, not if, when, you'll remember these nights. This room, the grinding machine that broke, the days we went hungry. Promise me you'll never forget where we started, because that's where our strength comes from. They made a vow then, the 4 of them, hands stacked one on top of another like a team heading into battle. We build an empire, Zara said. We never forget who we were, Amara added. And Mama never cries again. Chisholm finished, her voice fierce with the kind of determination that only comes from watching your mother break and then watching her rebuild herself into something stronger. Outside their window, Ajegunle continued its nightly symphony. Generators, music, arguments, laughter, the sounds of people surviving. But inside their single room, the triplet fire was burning brighter, and the whole world was about to feel its heat. 3 years into his marriage, Chukwudi understood that he'd traded one prison for another, except this one had marble floors and a view of the Atlantic Ocean that mocked him every morning. The Lekki penthouse Mrs. Okonkwo had promised was real enough, for bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen with appliances he didn't know how to use. But he'd learned too late that luxury came with a price tag counted in dignity rather than naira. Chukwudi, Mrs. Okonkwo's voice cut through the apartment like a blade. Did you remember to pick up my dry cleaning? Or are you as useless today as you were yesterday? He was sitting in what she called the guest room, the smallest bedroom, the one farthest from hers, where he'd been sleeping for the past 18 months after she declared his snoring intolerable. In truth, she'd simply grown bored of him once the novelty of having a handsome younger husband had worn thin. I'll get it this afternoon, he said quietly, hating how small his voice sounded. This afternoon? I needed it this morning. For the hotel investors meeting. The meeting you weren't invited to, obviously, because you're barely qualified to serve them drinks, much less sit at the table. She appeared in his doorway, immaculate in a cream suit that probably cost more than he used to make in a month. Her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. My bush boy. That's what Regina calls you, you know. At the country club. Everyone finds it hilarious that I married someone from your background. Chukwudi's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, but he said nothing. He'd learned that fighting back only made things worse. The VP position she'd promised had materialized for exactly 3 months before she'd restructured the company and demoted him to executive assistant to the CEO. Which meant he fetched her coffee, organized her schedule, and endured the pitying looks from actual executives who remembered when he'd briefly been their equal. The Lekki penthouse was hers, titled in her name alone. The car he drove belonged to the company. Even his clothes, the expensive suits he wore to work, she'd bought, and she never let him forget it. The prenup is very clear, she'd reminded him during their last argument, waving the document he'd signed in those early days of infatuation and ambition. If we divorce, you leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which, if memory serves, was nothing but debt and a tacky suit from Balogun Market. Worse than the public humiliation were the private cruelties. Mrs. Okonkwo had lovers. She didn't even bother hiding them. Young men, usually in their 20s, who she'd parade through the apartment with deliberate carelessness. Chukwudi would return from running her errands to find strange shoes by the door, strange voices in her bedroom, strange cars parked in his designated spot. "Don't look so wounded," she'd say when he confronted her once, her voice dripping with amusement. "You married me for money. I married you for decoration. We both got what we paid for, didn't we?" On particularly bad nights, alone in his guest room while laughter echoed from her bedroom down the hall, Ajegunle would think about Adanna. Not with longing exactly, but with a sick sort of regret that tasted like poison. He'd remember her quiet competence, the way she'd managed their household on almost nothing, how she'd never made him feel small even when he'd had so little to offer. He'd traded steady love for spectacular wealth and discovered too late that wealth without respect was just another form of poverty. He tried calling his daughters once. Just once. Worked up the courage after too many whiskeys, dialed Adanna's old number with shaking hands. Disconnected. The mechanical voice had felt like judgment. He could have searched harder, hired someone, asked around, but pride stopped him. What would he even say? How could he face them after what he'd done? Then came the Wednesday morning that changed everything. Mrs. Ajegunle was at the breakfast table reading a business magazine when she went very still. Ajegunle, pouring her coffee with the mechanical precision of a well-trained servant, noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked. She turned the magazine around, her face unreadable. The cover showed 3 young women standing in front of a gleaming office building, arms linked, smiling with the confidence of people who'd conquered something difficult. The headline read, "The Triplet Queens: How 3 Sisters Built a 20 Billion Nigerian Naira's Food Empire from Ajegunle." Ajegunle's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. Because he recognized those faces. Older, more polished, but unmistakable.
Thara,
Amara,
Chisholm,
his daughters. And behind them, just barely visible in the photograph, a woman in an elegant iro and buba whose face he'd tried so hard to forget. Adanna. His hands trembled as he picked up the magazine, reading with growing horror. Triplet Fire Spice. Started from nothing in a single room in Ajegunle. Now sold in ShopRite, on Amazon, in specialty stores across Europe. 20 billion Nigerian Naira's valuation. The article detailed everything. Adanna's resilience after divorce, her early morning market hustle, the daughters who'd become her business partners, the elderly trader who'd believed in her when no one else did. And there, in paragraph 7, like a knife twisted slowly, Ms. Okafor credits her success to her daughter's unwavering support during the darkest period of her life, after her ex-husband abandoned the family to marry his wealthy boss, leaving them destitute and homeless. The words blurred. His chest tightened. The room spun. "Well," Mrs. Ajegunle said, her voice cold with calculation. "This is unfortunate." By noon, the story had gone viral. Social media exploded with outrage. #DeadbeatDad was trending. Someone had found his photo, his name, details about his current employment. The comments were vicious, relentless, spreading like wildfire across every platform. This is the man who threw away billions to marry a hotel owner and became her errand boy. Karma is a woman who builds empires while you fetch dry cleaning. His daughters became queens while he became a joke. Mrs. Ajegunle called him into her office that evening, her face a mask of cold fury. "You're fired. This scandal is affecting my brand. The prenup is clear. We're divorcing immediately. You have 48 hours to vacate the apartment." "But I have nowhere." "You should have thought about that before you abandoned a woman who apparently had more potential in her little finger than you have in your entire body." Her smile was cruel, triumphant. "You know what the funniest part is? I married you because I thought you were ambitious. Turns out you just married the wrong woman. She was the ambitious one all along." 2 days later, Ajegunle stood outside the Lekki penthouse with a single suitcase containing everything he owned, watching Mrs. Ajegunle's driver pull away. His phone was dead. She'd cut off his line. His bank account was empty. Everything had been tied to her. He had no job, no home, no family, nothing. Except a magazine in his suitcase with his daughters' faces on the cover, and the terrible knowledge that while he'd been busy destroying himself for wealth that was never really his, The family he discarded had built an empire from ashes. Chukwudi spent 3 weeks living in a budget hotel in Ikeja, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument and transaction, where cockroaches owned the bathroom after midnight, and where the receptionist looked at him with the particular contempt reserved for men whose fall from grace was visible in the wear of their once expensive suits. The money ran out on day 22. After that, he moved to a friend's couch in Mushin. Except Lawrence wasn't really a friend anymore, just someone who owed him a favor from years ago and couldn't quite refuse when Chukwudi showed up at his door with desperation in his eyes. Just for a few days, Chukwudi had promised. Until I find work. That was 6 weeks ago. Every morning, Chukwudi scrolled through job listings on Lawrence's laptop, sending applications that disappeared into void after void. His name had become poison. The viral story had attached itself to him like a brand, and HR departments across Lagos recognized him instantly. "We'll be in touch," was the polite version. Most just never responded at all. The worst part wasn't the poverty, though that was brutal enough, going from penthouse living to rationing meals and wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row. The worst part was the recognition. Lagos was too small, the story too viral. He couldn't walk through a market without whispers following him like shadows. Couldn't enter a restaurant without seeing people pull out their phones, comparing his face to the photos that had circulated online. Couldn't exist without being reminded that he'd become a cautionary tale, a punchline, a symbol of karmic justice delivered with surgical precision. One afternoon, desperate for any income, he tried to get a security guard position at a small company in Ikeja. The manager, a woman in her 40s, had looked at him with something between pity and disgust. "You're the one, aren't you? The one who left his family for that hotel woman." She'd shaken her head slowly. "My sister is a single mother. 3 children. Their father ran off just like you did. She works 2 jobs, grinds every day, barely keeps food on the table. And you want me to give you a job?" Her laugh was bitter. "No, I don't think so. Go grind the way your ex-wife did. See how you like it." He'd walked out feeling something crack inside him that hadn't fully broken before. Not anger, he had no right to anger. Just a hollowness that seemed to expand until it filled every corner of his chest. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in November. Chukwudi was alone in Lawrence's apartment. His host had made it clear he needed space and had started dropping hints about how 2 months was longer than expected when he saw the business magazine on the coffee table. A different issue from the one that had first destroyed him, but with a familiar cover story. Triplet Fire Global, from local success to international phenomenon. His hands shook as he opened it. The article was extensive, detailed, devastating. It chronicled the company's expansion with the precision of a documentary. How Triplet Fire had secured contracts with major grocery chains across West Africa. How their organic line had won international food safety awards. How Zara Okafor, now 21 and a recent University of Lagos business graduate, had negotiated distribution deals that put their products in European markets. How Amara's food science innovations had earned her recognition from agricultural development organizations. How Chisholm's design work had turned their packaging into something museums were requesting for exhibitions on African entrepreneurship. The photographs were worse than the words. There was Adanna. No longer the exhausted woman in a faded wrapper he'd left behind, but someone transformed. Not just in appearance, though she looked healthy, radiant, powerful, but in presence. In the way she stood with her daughters at the grand opening of Triplet Fire Global Headquarters in Victoria Island, a gleaming glass tower that made Mrs. Okonkwo's hotels look modest by comparison. In the way the camera captured her mid-laugh, surrounded by investors and dignitaries and people who clearly respected her. And his daughters. God, his daughters. Zara in a sharp business suit, looking like she'd been born to command boardrooms. Amara holding up an award for innovation in organic food production. Chisholm standing before one of her billboard designs, the 3 intertwined stars, now a nationally recognized symbol. The article mentioned him only briefly. MS. Okafor's journey began after a difficult divorce left her homeless with 3 young daughters. But the comments section online, because of course he looked, because self-destruction had become his only reliable habit, was less restrained. Remember when this man said his daughters were anchors dragging him down? Look at them now. His ex-wife is worth more than he'll see in 10 lifetimes, and he's living on someone's couch. Poetry. Imagine throwing away a woman this strong because you thought she wasn't good enough for you. But it was the final section of the article that destroyed him completely. A sidebar interview with Adanna herself, conducted at the headquarters opening. Interviewer: what would you say to women going through similar struggles? Adanna: that your worth is not defined by the people who abandon you. That your children are watching how you respond to being broken, and you're teaching them either how to give up or how to rebuild. That there are angels disguised as elderly market traders, as kind teachers, as customers who believe in you. That grinding pepper at 4 a.m. in a single room in Ajegunle can become the foundation of an empire if you refuse to let shame steal your fire. Interviewer: do you have any message for your ex-husband? Adanna: long pause. I hope he finds peace. I hope he learns that wealth without character is poverty in expensive packaging. But mostly, I hope he understands that he taught my daughters their most valuable lesson, that a woman's strength doesn't come from the man beside her, but from the fire within her that no one can extinguish unless she lets them. Chakoti read those words 7 times, each reading driving the knife deeper. She'd wished him peace. Not suffering. Not revenge. Just peace. Somehow that was worse than hatred would have been. It meant he was irrelevant. It meant she'd moved so far beyond him that even anger was wasted energy. The headquarters grand opening was scheduled for next week. The article included the address, the time, the invitation for media and public attendance. A celebration of resilience. A ribbon-cutting ceremony that would officially launch Triplet Fire into its next phase of global expansion. Chakoti stared at the address until the letters blurred. Victoria Island. The same neighborhood where he'd once lived in that penthouse with Mrs. Ajegunle, feeling like he'd finally made it. Now his daughters had a building there. His ex-wife, the woman he'd called beneath him, owned property in the most expensive business district in Lagos. Something desperate and pathetic crawled up his throat. He had to see them, had to tell them he was sorry, had to somehow make them understand that he'd made a mistake, that he regretted everything, that maybe, there was still room for him in this story they'd written without him. He knew it was selfish, knew he had no right, knew that showing up uninvited to claim connection to success he'd played no part in building was the act of a man who'd learned nothing. But desperation and pride were poor teachers, and he'd been their student for too long to suddenly develop wisdom. The grand opening was in 6 days. He had no invitation, no right to attend, no place in their triumph. But he was going anyway. Because some part of him, the same part that had signed those divorce papers believing he was trading up, the same part that had chosen Mrs. Ajegunle's money over Adanna's love, still couldn't accept that the story was over, and he wasn't the hero. He would go. He would see them. And somehow, impossibly, he would make them understand. It was the worst decision he'd ever make. But then again, his life had become a catalog of those. The morning of the grand opening arrived with the kind of cloudless blue sky that Lagos reserved for important occasions, as if even the weather understood that history was being made. Chakoti stood across the street from Triplet Fire Global Headquarters, hidden among the crowd of onlookers gathering on the sidewalk, and felt his knees weaken at the sight of what his former family had built. The building was 15 stories of glass and steel, modern and elegant, with the Triplet Fire logo, 3 intertwined stars, emblazoned across the top in letters that caught the morning sun and threw light across Victoria Island like a declaration of victory. Red carpet stretched from the entrance to the street. Security personnel in crisp uniforms lined the pathway. Television crews jostled for position. Photographers tested their equipment. A banner across the entrance read, "From Ajegunle to the world, the Triplet Fire story." Chakoti had worn his best remaining suit, the charcoal one that Mrs. Ajegunle hadn't taken back, now slightly wrinkled and smelling faintly of Lawrence's cramped apartment. He'd shaved carefully that morning, trying to resurrect some semblance of the man he used to be, but the face in the mirror had looked hollow, defeated, aged beyond its years by regret. The crowd swelled as the ceremony time approached. Investors in expensive agbadas and designer suits. Government officials with their entourages. Media personalities. Business moguls. Market women from Balagan and Ajegunle, dressed in their finest, come to witness one of their own ascend. The diversity of the crowd told its own story. This wasn't just a corporate event, it was a cultural moment. Then the main doors opened, and the crowd fell silent. Adanna emerged first, and Chakuti's breath caught in his throat. She wore an iro and buba in deep emerald green with gold threading that caught the light with every movement, her geli wrapped with regal precision, her neck adorned with coral beads that spoke of tradition and dignity. But it wasn't the clothes that transformed her, it was the way she carried herself. Shoulders back, head high, moving with the confidence of someone who'd earned every inch of ground she walked on. Her face, once lined with exhaustion and defeat, now glowed with health and purpose. She looked like royalty. She looked like justice personified. Behind her came the triplets, and Chakuti felt tears prick his eyes because he barely recognized them. Zara, 21 now, wore a sharp navy suit, her hair styled professionally, carrying herself like the operations director she'd become. Every inch her mother's daughter, but with an edge of corporate precision that spoke of boardroom battles already won. Amara, in a white lab coat over traditional attire, held a framed award in her hands, her quiet intelligence visible in every measured movement. And Chisholm, the dreamer, wore a dress covered in the pattern of her own design, 3 stars repeated in intricate variations, looking like an artist who'd learned to translate vision into empire. They moved as one unit, these 4 women, arms linked, their bond visible in the synchronized way they navigated the carpet, paused for photographs, and approached the ribbons stretched across the entrance. Journalists shouted questions. Cameras flashed like lightning. The crowd pressed forward, everyone wanting to witness this moment. Chakuti found himself moving without thinking, pushing through the crowd, his desperation overriding common sense and dignity. Security noticed him immediately. A man in a wrinkled suit shoving through invited guests, but he kept moving, kept pressing forward until he breached the red carpet barrier. Adanna. His voice cracked, desperate and too loud. Adanna, please. I need to talk to you. The crowd turned as one. The cameras swiveled toward the commotion. Security moved in, but Adanna raised one hand, stopping them. The gesture was so commanding, so absolutely certain of its authority, that everyone froze. She turned slowly, her eyes finding him in the crowd, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across 6 years and an unbridgeable distance of choices made and consequences delivered. Chakuti. His name on her lips sounded like a fact being stated, not an accusation, not even surprise. Just acknowledgement that he existed, barely. He stumbled forward, tears already streaming down his face, all pretense of dignity abandoned. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. Please, I need to be part of this. Part of their lives again. Our daughters, Adanna. Let me be part of their success. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye was on them. Every phone was recording. This moment would be viral within minutes, and some distant part of Chakuti's brain understood that, but he couldn't stop. Our success. Zara's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She stepped forward, positioning herself between her mother and him, protective and fierce. There is no R, sir. You made that very clear 6 years ago when you called us anchors. I was wrong. I was foolish. You were honest, Amara interjected, her quiet voice somehow louder than shouting. For once in your marriage, you were completely honest about what you valued. Money over family. Status over love. Mrs. Okonkwo's penthouse over your own children. Chisholm said nothing, but her eyes, once so full of childish adoration for her father, looked at him with something worse than hatred.
Pity.
She pitied him. Adanna moved forward then, gently placing her hands on her daughter's shoulders, guiding them back. She approached Chikwudi with slow, measured steps, and he found himself unable to meet her eyes. "Look at me," she said softly. He forced his gaze up. Her eyes held no anger, no satisfaction at his downfall. Just a calm, immovable strength that made him feel like he was looking at a mountain and asking it to move. "You came here today hoping for what, exactly?" Her voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Forgiveness? Reconciliation? A place in the story you abandoned 6 years ago. I want to make it right. I want to be their father again." "You taught them everything they needed to know about fatherhood," Adanna said, and there was no cruelty in her tone, just truth delivered like medicine. "You taught them that a man's love can be conditional, that promises can be broken when something shinier appears, that children can be discarded like inconvenient baggage. These were valuable lessons, Chikwudi. Painful, but valuable." "Please, Adanna." "You also taught them something you didn't intend," she continued, speaking now to the crowd as much as to him, her voice carrying across the gathered witnesses. "You taught them that their worth doesn't come from the man who should have protected them, that resilience matters more than approval, that 3 girls and their mother can build something extraordinary from nothing if they refuse to accept the limitations others place on them." She stepped closer, and Chikwudi could smell the faint scent of shea butter and success. "Chikwudi, I hope you find peace. I genuinely do. I hope you learn that wealth without character is just poverty in expensive packaging. I hope you understand that the woman you called beneath you was always capable of heights you couldn't imagine because you were too busy looking down to see up." She paused, her next words measured and final. "But you are not part of the story anymore. You gave up that right when you signed those papers, when you stopped paying rent and let us be evicted, when you told your daughters they were anchors dragging you down." "They're my daughters too," he cried out, desperate, grasping. "No," Zara said, stepping forward again. "You're the man who contributed DNA. Mama built us. Mama and Karuka believed in us. Our community supported us. You're just a lesson we learned, an example of what not to become." Security moved in then, professional and firm, hands on Chikwidi's elbows. He didn't resist. What was the point? The cameras were recording his humiliation. Social media was already exploding. He could see people in the crowd holding up phones, capturing every moment of his pathetic attempt at redemption. As they escorted him away from the red carpet, Adanna returned to her daughters, linking arms with them once more. They turned toward the ribbon, scissors raised, united and unbreakable. The crowd erupted in applause. The cameras flashed. And Chikwudi heard, above all the noise, Adanna's voice carrying clear and strong. This empire was built by women who refused to let abandonment define them. Today, we don't just cut a ribbon, we cut ties with every limitation society tried to place on us. We rise not despite our struggles, but because of them, and we rise together. The ribbon fell. The crowd roared. Confetti cannons exploded overhead, filling the air with green and gold. The colors of growth and wealth, of nature and prosperity. And Chikwudi was escorted off the property, away from the celebration, removed from the story like a footnote being deleted, his last view of his family showing them disappearing through the doors of an empire he would never enter, arms still linked, still burning bright. The security guard who walked him to the street corner wasn't unkind. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'd advise you not to return. This is their day. Let them have it." Chikwudi nodded, unable to speak, and walked away through streets he used to know when he lived in that penthouse with Mrs. Okonkwo, when he thought he'd finally made something of himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was blocks away from where he'd once felt like a success, now homeless and broken, while the family he discarded owned the most impressive building on the horizon. Behind him, even from blocks away, he could still see the Triplet Fire logo catching the sun, 3 stars burning bright enough to be visible across all of Victoria Island. A reminder.
A rebuke.
A monument to everything he'd thrown away. 6 months after the grand opening, Adanna stood in the wings of the Eco Convention Center, smoothing the fabric of her deep purple iro and buba while the master of ceremonies introduced Triplet Fire's first anniversary gala. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see the ballroom packed with over 1,000 guests, investors, government officials, international distributors, and most importantly, market women from Balagan, Ajegunle, and Yaba who'd supported them from the beginning. They'd flown in representatives from their European and American distribution partners. CNN was covering it. This wasn't just a corporate celebration. It had become a cultural moment. "Mama, you ready?" Zara appeared beside her, immaculate in a gold gown that complemented her mother's purple, carrying herself with the poise of someone who'd recently been featured in Forbes Africa's 30 Under 30. "I'm ready, my love." Adanna squeezed her daughter's hand. "Where are your sisters?" Amara's backstage checking on the presentation equipment. You know how she is, and Chisholm is taking photos of the decorations for her design portfolio. Zara smiled. "We're all here. We're all ready." The MC's voice boomed across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the visionaries behind Triplet Fire Global, Ms. Adanna Okafor and her daughters, the Triplet Queens." The applause was thunderous as they walked onto the stage together, their entrance choreographed not by professionals, but by years of moving as one unit. The screens behind them displayed images from their journey. The original hand-drawn logo, photos of their first stall in Balagan Market, newspaper clippings tracking their rise, and finally, the gleaming headquarters in Victoria Island. Adanna stepped to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, and felt tears prick her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of completion, of arrival. 6 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear. "I stood in a single room in Ajegunle with 3 daughters, a broken grinding machine, and no idea how we would survive the next day. I had been told I was beneath consideration, that my children were anchors, that I was nothing without a man to validate my existence." The room had gone completely silent. But in that market, among vendors fighting for every kobo, I learned something that no business school could teach. I learned that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. That poverty is temporary, but character is permanent. That 3 small girls and their mother, grinding pepper at 4 a.m., can build something that no amount of inherited wealth could purchase, a foundation of love, resilience, and unbreakable purpose. She paused, looking at her daughters standing beside her. "This empire you're celebrating tonight was built by women who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. But we didn't do it alone." The screens behind her shifted to show a new image, an elderly woman in a faded wrapper standing in front of a market stall, her face weathered but her smile radiant. The crowd murmured in recognition. Many of the market women in attendance knew that face. "Mama Nkaruka," Adanna said, her voice thick with emotion, "was an Igbo trader in Balagan Market who watched me weep when my machine broke down. She had every reason to protect her own small capital, to look away, to let me fail like the thousands of others who fail every day in Lagos markets. Instead, she lent me money with only one condition, that I never let shame steal my fire." The screen changed again, showing a document, an investment agreement dated from 5 years ago. What we didn't know, Zara stepped forward to continue the story, was that Mama Nkaruka wasn't just lending capital.
She was investing.
Quietly, without fanfare or demand for recognition, she became our first silent investor. When we tried to repay her initial loan, she refused. Instead, she asked that we invest in other women the way she'd invested in us. Amara moved to the microphone next. "Every quarter for 5 years, Mama Nkaruka has donated her returns to a fund we established, the Triplet Fire Women's Capital Fund. To date, we've provided interest-free loans to 347 market women across Lagos, helping them buy equipment, expand their businesses, and feed their families. Mama Nkaruka's initial investment has multiplied 100 times over, not in her bank account, but in the lives she's touched. Chisholm, the youngest, spoke last, her voice carrying the same emotion that had defined her since childhood. Tonight, we want to honor the woman who saw potential where others saw poverty, who chose love over profit, who proved that the most powerful investment you can make is believing in someone when no one else will. The spotlight shifted to the audience, finding an elderly woman in the front row. Maman Karuka, now dressed in beautiful green lace and coral beads, looked startled as the crowd rose in a standing ovation. Tears streamed down her weathered face as Adanna descended from the stage and walked toward her. "You told me never to let shame steal my fire," Adanna said, taking the old woman's hands in hers, speaking into a wireless microphone so the whole room could hear.
"But you did more than that, Ma.
You taught me that dignity is measured not by what we have, but by what we give. That true wealth is found in the lives we change, not the bank accounts we build. That an empire built on love will always outlast one built on greed." She turned to face the audience, still holding Mama and Karuka's hands. "Tonight, I'm announcing that we are establishing the Mama and Karuka Institute for Women Entrepreneurs in Ajegunle, a permanent facility offering business training, access to capital, mentorship, and childcare support for single mothers building businesses from nothing, just like we did. Mama and Karuka's name will be attached to opportunity forever." The applause was deafening. Many in the audience were openly weeping. Mama and Karuka collapsed into Adanna's embrace, and their reunion, grandmother and daughter in all but blood, was captured by dozens of cameras and would be viewed millions of times by morning. But Adanna had one more thing to say. As the applause died down and she returned to the stage, she looked directly into the camera broadcasting live. "There is someone who is not here tonight, but whose absence teaches its own lesson. 6 years ago, my ex-husband told me I was beneath him. He chose wealth over family, status over love, a penthouse over his own children. Today, I want to say something to every woman watching who has ever been told she is not enough, who has ever been abandoned, who has ever been made to feel small." Her voice grew stronger, filling every corner of the massive ballroom. "Your worth is not defined by the people who abandon you. Your value is not measured by the man who underestimated you. Your potential is not limited by the ones who couldn't see it. Grind your pepper. Draw your logos. Keep your accounts. Build your empires. And when you succeed, not if, but when, remember where you came from so you can reach back and pull others forward." She paused, her eyes glistening. "To the man who signed those divorce papers thinking he was trading up, you taught my daughters that a woman's strength doesn't require a man's approval. You taught them that being discarded was the greatest gift you could give us, because it forced us to discover what we were capable of without you. For that lesson, I thank you. But you are not part of this story. You never were. This empire was built by the people you called anchors, and we have risen so high that you cannot even see us from where you fell." The crowd erupted. Social media exploded. Within minutes, clips of her speech were trending across multiple platforms. #Triplet Fire. #Anchors Rise Up. #Mom and Karuka. The story wasn't just about business success. It had become a movement, a declaration that society's discarded women could become its most powerful forces. Later that evening, after the formal presentations ended and the celebration shifted to mingling and dancing, Adanna stood with her daughters on the balcony overlooking Lagos. The city sprawled beneath them, millions of lights representing millions of stories, struggles, and secret empires being born in single rooms and market stalls. "Do you think he was watching?" Chisholm asked quietly. Adanna considered this. "Probably. But it doesn't matter anymore, my love. We didn't build this for him to see. We built it because we refused to die in that single room in Ajegunle. We built it for every woman who's been told she's not enough. We built it for Mom and Karuka, for the market women who supported us, for each other." Zara wrapped her arm around her mother's waist. "We built it because you taught us that fire doesn't ask permission to burn." Amara nodded. "And that the brightest flames come from the darkest places." Chisholm held up her phone, showing them her latest design, a new logo she'd been working on, expanding the Triplet Fire stars into a constellation. This is for the Institute. I'm calling it a 1,000 fires. Because that's what we're doing, right? Lighting fires everywhere. Adanna looked at her daughters. These three miracles who should have been crushed, but instead became unstoppable, and felt something settle in her chest. Not closure exactly, because their story was still being written, but completion. The journey from that courtroom where she'd been humiliated, through the eviction and grinding poverty, past the broken machine and Mom and Karuka's intervention, through years of 4 a.m. wake-ups and relentless grinding, had led here.
To this balcony.
To this empire. To this moment of perfect, hard-won peace. 1,000 fires, she repeated, pulling her daughters close. And they'll all burn bright because we refuse to let shame extinguish the first one. Far below, Lagos continued its eternal dance, grinding, hustling, surviving, dreaming. And somewhere in those millions of lights, other women were waking at 4 a.m. starting their own journeys, building their own empires from nothing but determination and love. The Triplet Fire had become exactly what Mama and Karuka promised it would be, not just a business, but a beacon. Proof that the powerless could become powerful, that the discarded could become invaluable, that women said they were anchors could rise up and become wings. And in that rising, they hadn't just built an empire. They'd rewritten the rules about who gets to be powerful, who deserves success, and what true wealth actually means. The moral blazed clear as the Lagos stars above them. Humility, resilience, and love will always outlast arrogance, greed, and betrayal. Those who discard the powerless today may one day watch from the shadows as the empire they built lights up the sky. And a mother who protects her daughter's fire will raise women who set the whole world ablaze. The story was complete. The justice was served. The fire burned eternal.